regarding Cain and Abel, the way that story is written is interesting, and we talked about it a few weeks ago, and it's one of the things that's striking about the way that story is presented is that we don't know what's wrong with the sacrifice exactly. We don't know what the benefits of the sacrifice are exactly. We only know that it's apparent to Cain and Abel that God is pleased with one and not pleased with the other. And just that knowledge seems to be enough to alter the course of events. That when you know that you've made a proper sacrifice, because God says, if you do right, won't you be uplifted, basically, to Cain? Why are you downcast? He's downcast because God didn't look at favorably on his sacrifice, and he's basically told, if you do right, won't you be uplifted? Won't your countenance rise? Won't you be lifted up? It's a funny thing that's kind of how life works. We know when we've lived according to God. We know when we've valued and honored God the right way. We know when we've made an appropriate sacrifice, and we know when we haven't. And outside of any, trumpet announcing the fact, and anybody, lifting up a scorecard and giving us like a 7, 8, or 9 on our sacrifice, outside of that stuff, and outside of the production of lucrative cash and prizes, outside of those things, which is kind of, for some silly reason we have in our minds, that's the way that things should lay themselves out. Outside of all of that, we do have a knowledge of when we've made an appropriate sacrifice. We do have a knowledge of when we've honored God and lifted God up. We do have a knowledge of when we've lived out and manifested the things that we should have. And it changes the way that we view ourselves. And the interesting thing is that should be obvious to us. Because if we're made in the image of God, then there's a strange way in which when we lift God up, we lift ourselves up. And I don't mean that from a standpoint of whenever we're worshiping God, we're really worshiping ourselves. I don't mean that. But I mean, if God is nothing and you've been made in the image of God, then what does that make you? I mean, if you value God, won't you? And strangely, what do you find on the earth is that the people who worship God and value God, the people who praise God and lift God up, aren't they the ones that have the higher view of human beings who see? I mean, wasn't it Jesus who was going around and healing people on the Sabbath and kind of running himself ragged to preach the gospel? And it wasn't the religious leaders, and it wasn't, it's the church that has gone out of its way to serve the needy and the lost, the downtrodden for thousands of years. Strangely, you don't find people with a low view of God doing the same thing.
Right.
Which is instructive. And obviously you're a human being too. And at some point that affects your view of yourself. And even what I find instructive is that when you get down to it, what God is really asking you to do in calling you to be obedient, he's actually asking you to treat yourself as if you have the value that he says you do.
Right.
To not treat yourself casually.
Yeah. Do you believe what he says about you? Do you live as if that's a real thing and that it's true?
Right.
Does it impact the decisions you make?
Right.
Of course.
There's a connection here between valuing God and the outcome of your life, and it's not something that you can just dispense with, and it's not something that you can counterfeit. It's not something, and it's something that, and in some way, has to be acted out. It's not enough for it to be a mental exercise.
Sure, you can't behave one way in a fashion that's contradictory to what you believe. They will align in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and it's often our behaviors that will end up affecting our beliefs, which is why sin is so destructive. I think, and I mean, how many, especially lately over the last probably 3 years or so, there's been a pretty big, there's been a spate of religious leaders, Christian leaders, especially in the emergent church and those kinds of areas that have left the church. And at every turn, what you see is that the leaving of the church was preceded by a long-term behavior that was contrary to the beliefs of the church.
Right.
It's not that these guys just all of a sudden said to themselves, "Well, I don't believe this anymore."
Yeah.
It's that there was a behavior at some point, as you say, that at some point the behavior and the belief system had to be reconciled.
Yeah.
And it's the behavior that actually determined what the beliefs were going to be.
Yeah.
And so obviously God has an interest in this for Abraham, and it's it should be no surprise to us that there is a connection, there's a blessing that occurs after this, because that's how else could it be? And it's not that you can just say, well, the blessing was, he got 500 more sheep and, a few extra. That's not the way that it works itself out.
Right.
It's not like you can just quantify. It's not a video game where, you go around picking up, the blessings at the proper
Loot crate.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like that at all. So one of the things I think that we can talk about in relationship to this story is the connection between the root and the fruit. And what I mean by that is, God develops this relationship with Abraham, and of course there are blessings that come along with it, one of them being his son Isaac. And at some point, Abraham has to choose between God and the blessing. And that seems like an odd choice, I think, but maybe it shouldn't be odd to us. What I mean by odd is it seems strange that God, maybe to modern eyes, it seems strange that God would ask or bring about this series of events that makes Abraham choose between God and his blessings. But maybe that shouldn't be strange to us. Do you see in our culture, in our world, and the things around you, any places where there's a battle that goes on between root and fruit? Any places where the fruit of something starts to become more important than the root of something?
Like everything, I'm trying to. Well, I'm thinking that could Abraham have the blessing of his son outside of, if he had to choose between his son or God, could he have his son without God? I mean, let's say he chose to keep his son alive. Mm-hmm. He doesn't get God then. Right. He's choosing again. But by choosing God, he gets his son as well. Mm-hmm. And that fruit, his son, the blessing, cannot exist outside of God. And I think that in today's day and age, we all want certain things without the thing that precedes them. I want to be healthy without exercising. Mm-hmm. I want to eat anything I want, a gallon of ice cream, and have no consequence. How is it that I can have a blessing without the thing that makes the blessing possible? I just don't think it's possible. You're looking for specific examples, and I've given you none.
I think in this day and age, sometimes we can find somebody who's successful, say like a successful entrepreneur or CEO of a company, and we'll look at them and just be like, oh, I want that. I want to be like that, But we don't go back in time and say, what is the last 10 years up till this point
up
looked like for this person
doing the work,
up till 2 a.m. and the work ethic and the blood and the sweat and the tears, and we're not thinking about wanting that. I just want the final result.
Yeah. I think that even within that entrepreneur's own life, I think a lot of times they were energized by the work that they were doing. It kept them up till 2 a.m. and there's an element of wanting to take on maybe the big players in the marketplace, but there was also the excitement of really creating something new and something useful, something that really meets a need, and seeing that take off. And they were disruptive in the marketplace because the old players were all about their profits now and not creating anything that people really needed or wanted, not being responsive to the market. And a young company comes in and they really are, and they'll stay up all night. And it's not even because they're thinking, oh, I want to be some tycoon. Maybe that's in the back of their mind, but it really is the excitement of what they're doing that's driving them. And then, you go to that same entrepreneur maybe 30 years later, and now, they have the big house, they have the yacht, they have the market share, they have all that. And what are they doing? They're in Congress trying to lobby for laws that will prevent the new young upstart from taking the market share, because now it's all about the market share and it's not about innovating or creating or doing something for the people that they serve any longer. I think that's always a problem. And I think, you can, I was reading the other day about somebody who was talking about one of the ideas that theologians kind of play around with in regards to the tree in the garden. Trees in the Old Testament and in the ancient Near East were often places of judgment. That the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it's possible, could have been a place of judgment. And what you would then have is you would have Adam and Eve not making a judgment about the serpent at the place where they should have made a judgment about the serpent, but wanting the fruit of wanting the fruit of kingship without actually being kings. Without making those distinctions and those discernments. Which I think is an interesting, it's speculative, but it would be interesting if that were the case, because you certainly see a lot in the Bible about this idea of wanting to have the blessings of something without the thing that actually brings the blessing. And that's certainly true sometimes in our relationship with God. We want the car, or we want the house, we want the good relationships, we want the feeling of purpose and meaning in our life, but we don't always just want God, and that can be a real problem. And sometimes we have to choose between some of those blessings that God gives us and God, and it's not a bad thing that God brings that into our life, because we need to be set back on track.